So how do you get started with filming? How do you set up your camera? It's a basic question, but it's one that's absolutely essential that you know the answer to. Okay, here are the rules. Number 1, set your camera to record at 24 frames per second. This is the cinematic standard, which was introduced just as sound was introduced to film. Your audience expects a 24 per second production. It provides the frame rate which feels cinematic to them. In order to emulate the exact look and cinematic feel of celluloid, you also need to set your camera's shutter speed, if it has that option available. That shutter speed should be 1/2 times your camera's frame rate. Don't worry, fellow humanists, the maths isn't difficult. In this case, it's 1/2 times 24, 1/48. My camera doesn't actually record at that precise shutter speed, so I have to set it to 1/50. So just get as near as you can. But what that will do is give you the right amount of motion blur that the human eye and mind has become accustomed to after a lifetime of watching film and cinema. Remember, even digital cinema, the newest movies being made today, are still being shot at 24 frames per second using a shutter speed which will provide the amount of motion blur which would have been captured on celluloid. If you use these settings, you will give your production, before you even try framing a shot, a cinematic sheen. It's also important that you learn how your camera works, at least at a very basic level, so you can understand what it's doing. Cameras aren't complex. They are very simple devices. In fact, you have a lens which brings in light. That light is then focused, in our case, onto a sensor which records. One of the things you have to work hardest on is making sure that the correct amount of light gets onto your sensor, that you are not over or under exposing your shots. So how do you achieve that? Well, there are 3 ways you can do that. Number 1 is to increase the aperture size of your lens. That's literally just the size of the hole through which light travels. The larger that hole is, the more light comes through and is exposed on your sensor. The second is to change your shutter speed. The problem is that our shutter speed is locked in at 1/48 or 1/150. So that option is taken off the table for us. So the third and final way that you can bring more or less light into your camera is by increasing the sensitivity of your lens. And that's achieved by adjusting something called the ISO setting. There are advantages and there are disadvantages to adjusting both the ISO and the aperture size. If you open up the aperture on your camera lens, you will flood the sensor with light. But you will also create a shallow focus, which might actually be the look you're looking for. As you can see right now, much of this scene is out of focus, whilst my face is in focus. If you're looking for this portrait style mode, then opening up your camera lens is absolutely essential. In fact, you should be looking for a camera lens that has an f-stop of 2.8 or less. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the smaller the f-stop number on your camera lens, the more light it lets in. This camera is filming with an f-stop of 2.8, but this camera is filming with an f-stop of 4.0, and everything is much more in focus. So you can open up your aperture and let in more light, but be aware your focus will become much shallower as a result. The other way that you can increase or decrease the sensitivity of your camera is by increasing the ISO. However, as you increase the ISO, you will introduce something called noise. Noise is a type of film grain which you can see on the example on screen now. Some cameras are very good at handling low light situations. You can keep increasing the ISO and there will be a small or even no depreciation in image quality. But with some cameras, increasing the ISO will result in a significant decrease in image quality. I also want to talk to you about focus. Focus is something that you must do every single time you set up a shot, every single time that you touch the camera in fact. Specifically, during an interview, you should focus upon one thing on your subject, their eyes. If you're using a lens with a wide open aperture and a shallow focus, for example, it's very easy to focus on the tip of someone's nose, and although it looks great on those tiny small screens on your camera, when you blow that footage up, everything looks blurry. Your audience likely doesn't need to have their attention drawn to the tip of your subject's nose. The eyes are where the interview happens. That is where you must focus. Finally, I want you to be aware of areas in your shot in which there is no detail in either the shadows or the highlights. If you have overexposed any part of your image, it will be pure white and your camera will not be recording any detail. Conversely, if you have underexposed your image, parts of it will be black and no detail will be recorded there either. Try to expose your shots so that you get detail in both the highlights and in the shadows. And don't be dispirited. It can take a lot of practice to learn the ins and outs of your camera. And remember, even smartphones have to compensate and deal with low light conditions. So take your camera out, whatever type of device it is, and see how it copes in the night. See how it copes at twilight or at dawn, and see how it copes under the midday sun.